If Putin had known what he knows now, would he have invaded Ukraine? No. This is a blitz Q&A. We're not going to put your beautiful questions on the screen this time. We're just going to blitz through and then do more proper Q&A sessions later. He wouldn't have invaded Ukraine with a full-scale invasion, I think, if he knew then what he knows now. That means that he would have done a more partial invasion and would have thought about escalating in other territories. He would have perhaps considered trying something in the Baltics. The grand strategy would have remained the same. Challenge the West to some kind of barely describable civilizational conflict that doesn't really make sense outside of Putin's terms, and then challenge NATO and challenge Article 5. So he would have considered escalating elsewhere instead, perhaps. Is Crimea Ukrainian? Well, speaking straight, it's Ukrainian, and there's a very simple story here. And the story is that it's not just that it was stolen with the little green men and the fake referendum. It's that for a transference like this to even generate a conversation about legitimacy, what you would first need is for a bit of a country to secede and only second join another country. So there can't even be a conversation about legitimacy. Having said this, I think that there can be something unhealthy about that moral test, which is quite different to the actual question. That moral test, whose is Crimea? Because I think that it can distance oneself from the concrete realities of politics, from actual questions of how Ukraine could get Crimea back in practice, rather than discussing that at a level of a kind of moral sphere that might not have much friction with agency, political agency on the ground that explains how things and how change comes about. Are you worried about Surovikin being in charge of Russia's offensive now? Well, that's a guy who was responsible for the deaths of 3 people in August 1991 in Russia when he directed a military column at civilians in Moscow. And he is old school in the sense of being courageous, very square, sort of primitive in his outlook on how things must be done. 2 + 2 = 4. Cruel, brutal, and endlessly compliant with any command that might be given. That could be one of the more disturbing aspects about him. He is the kind of guy who is disproportionately likely to execute increasingly bizarre and unacceptable commands. What advice would you give to somebody who is trying to critique one's sources on Ukraine? Well, I jotted down 5 words here. First of all, ensure factual accuracy. If you want to know about major publications covering the war, arguably the most factually accurate large journalistic institutions are the Financial Times and the Economist, but we're talking about just purely getting the facts right. Then there is the challenge of the individual aggregation of one's informational economy. And that's a problem for almost everybody today, that it's no longer possible to say these are the 2 publications I read and I'm not going to gather things from individual sources. We inevitably have to follow individual sources, and that's a problem that's partly caused by the crisis of journalism. I would say that's a big conversation we're going to just have to have separately. I would say distinguish whether you're listening to activists or analysts. An activist would prioritize change over truth, and analysts would prioritize truth over change. Be skeptical of moral hordes of self-congratulatory kind on Twitter and elsewhere. So be slow to join those, even if they have a point. you know? So don't get lost in all of that stuff about how silly Elon Musk is and all of that kind of stuff. It's often unhealthy as an activity, and it obstructs thought. And then I would say, this is the single most important point, know what you're choosing from. You know, the majority of people on YouTube have no idea what they're choosing from. They are aware of sort of 10, 15 sources, and they often make the very best choice out of these 10, 15. But the reality is they are missing the 50, 100 other sources that might be superior. And that often is a product of the fact that people don't understand that a lot of great experts are largely operating in the academic sphere. It's also that people don't understand that a social media app will never give you a convincing sample of the state of expertise on something. So there's a real kind of problem here that people are eating sort of apples and oranges because they're choosing between apples, oranges, pears and plums, but there's actually the full range of fruit out there. And I would say make sure you're familiar with that before you make your choice. So always be skeptical. You know, there's a kind of a tendency to take a completely side example. There's a kind of tendency to think for a lot of people who, for instance, follow the intellectual dark web online, that these people are the descendants of past intellectuals. That it goes sort of Nietzsche, Heidegger, God knows what, Gadamer, and then Jordan Peterson. No, that's a total cross-categorization. You're conflating serious stuff with entertainment. So be aware of what's what, and don't make your choice from too narrow a palette. I feel hawkish about Ukraine, but I'm normally against hawkish UN foreign policy. Am I steering the right course? This is very difficult. I've got a book here, just when I noted of your question, called Unfinest Hour by Brendan Sims. And Brendan wrote it about 20 years ago. And it's about Britain's awful policy toward Bosnia in the mid-90s, not recognizing that there was a genocidal Greater Serbia project there and conceiving of what was going on largely as a civil war. By the way, I made a slip about this in my interview with Jake Broe recently, where, of course, I didn't mean to say that what was happening in Yugoslavia was a civil war. I was still talking about the potential of civil war in Russia, and Yugoslavia came in. So it's very important that one doesn't make that error. And Brendan argues in the book that intervention was necessary. And if you believe that, then it doesn't really matter what else you think of other interventions. There's a compelling case there. I mean, I am quite hawkish on Ukraine, at least insofar as I think Ukraine should be given potentially even more weapons than it's being given now. I am very careful about the risk of nuclear war. I think there's a question about that coming up. But I'm quite hawkish on Ukraine, and I'm not typically hawkish on US foreign policy. And I think that's completely okay. I have not a single activist bone in my body, but I was, doing some stuff for the Stop the War Coalition before the Iraq War in 2002, because it was transparent that that war was going to be a catastrophe. So don't be discombobulated here, and we might come back a bit to this challenge you're facing when there's a nuclear question that comes up. But you've got to realize the United States is an empire, and it's an empire that's done a lot of things that we can stand by and a lot of things we really can't stand by, and that's the complexity of life. But we will talk more about this. But I think it's absolutely okay to be taking a position on a piecemeal basis here and actually avoid people who are sort of hawks or doves by principle without even noticing what country, whatever they're talking about it, is going on and what exactly is going on. That, in a way, is one of the problems with some of the discourse about Ukraine, that it's got nothing to do with Ukraine. It's an expression of local, for example, American domestic disputes about foreign policy. Don't do that. Don't talk about Ukraine without talking about Ukraine. Don't talk about Russia's invasion of Ukraine without talking about Russia. You know, by putting just random abstract hats on them that just express concerns that are domestic culture wars. Yeah. So be more comfortable with that position, because we live in a complex world. Do you think there's a Russian underground movement against Putin and his regime? I mean, if there is, do you think that they're collaborating with Ukraine? There is no evidence I'm aware of that is happening on any major scale, but because of the violent response of the regime to protest, we are likely to see the evolution of underground movements over the months, and the regime lasts a long time, years to come. At the moment, this stuff is very, very minimal. It's not showing up significantly, it seems to be. Are the Z-Patriots at risk of being repressed for criticizing the war, for criticizing the government, the regime, for not being hawkish enough on Ukraine? They are, but because they can't organize themselves politically, they are just a sort of a talking bunch. They don't pose an immediate threat to the Kremlin, and they're allowed to get away with quite a lot. Then there's an element of them being couriered by the agencies, and insofar as that happens through some of these radical outbursts, various micro wars within the agencies are being played out, and that can give some of these folks a little bit of extra protection. So it's a complex and precarious balance, but I wouldn't be comfortable about saying that these folks are all safe. What if there were no USA involvement in the war and only Europe was supporting Ukraine? Well, that goes back to the question about being hawkish on this issue but not on others, right? There's a bad answer here. I think largely Europe would have given away Ukraine to either to Russia or to the scenario of having to defend itself to a good extent alone against Russia. I think without the United States, the situation would have been radically different. There would have been divisions and complex politics in Europe, but collectively, Ukraine would have been mostly given away. So that's something to reflect upon. How is nuclear risk now? It's high. It's as high, if not higher, than at some of the peak points during the Cold War. And it could be higher because we've got a genuinely three-way dynamic here. We've not just got the United States and Russia. We've got Ukraine that's acting to a great extent in harmony with the aspirations of the United States, but not entirely so. You've got potentially other states that take a view on this, potential divisions within NATO about what should be done depending on what scenario arises. So if this were a flat conflict between Russia and the United States, the risk would be lower. But because of the complexness of agency here, the risk is quite unacceptably high at the moment. And I would predict that little by little it escalates until we have some kind of significant resolution, like, for example, Putin comprehensively losing the war and comprehensively losing power. We'll talk more about this, but certainly stories about how nuclear risk is largely not a factor now seem to be bogus, as do stories which say nuclear risk is such an important issue, even if the risk is 0.1%. The risk of a strategic nuclear exchange is not 0.1% at the moment. I mean, that's many fold off the correct guesstimated percentage point that instinctively feels right. So it's a problem, and we need to talk about it systematically, and we need to be awake to that risk, but not freak out about it. And that can be a difficult thing to balance, but certainly the risk is very, very significant. And one of the reasons Elon Musk has come out with his misguided comments is that he recognizes that there's a high risk. And about that, he's largely right. About his proposal and his solution, he's overwhelmingly wrong. So the position that I advocate here on this platform is that we do not give in to Russia's nuclear blackmail. But at the same time, we're not naive about the extent of nuclear risk. I'm going to talk about all of that more. The Nobel Peace Prize was shared between rights defenders from Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia. Podolyak, advisor to the Zelensky administration, said Ukraine should have been separated from these other countries which started a war against Ukraine. What are your thoughts? Ukraine has been brutally invaded. Ukrainian men have been killed. Ukrainian women and children have been killed. Ukrainian homes have been destroyed. People have had to flee. All of this is extraordinarily shocking, as war is shocking. And it's being done by a neighbor that essentially, outside of its own quasi-mythological thinking about this, had no reason to invade at all. So let's start about here. So Ukraine's on the right side of this, and Ukraine is on the wrong end of a brutal and completely insupportable invasion that is fundamentally unprovoked. So, you see, we've got to begin by enlarging our economy of sentiment about this. So, to some extent, yes, we do want to give Ukrainians the possibility to say whatever the hell they want about whatever the hell they want, given the situation they're facing. On the other hand, it's true that there is a conflict on the ex-Soviet space, and that conflict is about, let's say, democracy versus tyranny, very crudely. And that conflict is happening across different territories. Ukraine is taken a side in it, but that conflict is dividing Russia. There's some division about that conflict in Belarus, but less than in Russia. Belarus is more clearly sort of captured by an authoritarian dictator than Russia is at the moment. Well, Russia's moving in that direction of just being captured little by little. So what I would say is that you've got to recognize that there is that conflict happening on the ex-Soviet space. And it's healthy for Ukraine to take the side of democracy in that conflict, not just for itself, but for that entire space, because that's in Ukraine's medium-term security interests, not because it's right, because you've got to care about Russians or Belarusians. No, it's in Ukraine's national interest to do that, and self-destructive for Ukraine not to do that. So that counterbalances this claim that Ukrainians can say whatever the hell they want. Now let's put another dimension down. The Russian organization in this, for instance, is Memorial. That was part of the joint award. Memorial is one of the most important civic organizations in the Western world. And it keeps us connected to a situation where we both agitate and take stock and process the crimes of Stalinism. So here is Ukraine that is being sponsored to defend itself against Russia's brutal invasion by the West, by the United States above all, telling us to not recognize profoundly important civic organizations in our wider culture. Not going to pass. So certainly if I was on the committee and that kind of suggestion was being made that you needed to push away, Belarusian and Russian candidates, I would have resigned. It's completely incompatible with the best understanding of European values, but it's also very much against Ukraine's medium-term national interest. But you've got to be gentle here because Ukraine's in the middle of a war. and you've got to be able to understand how things feel and how things look. And you've got to be able also to understand the instinct, oh, I wish Russia didn't exist. You don't need to indulge that instinct beyond a certain point, because it's not going to be constructive, because Russia isn't going to go anywhere. But you've got to be able to understand that. And it's hard to understand it unless you are in the middle of a war where you are overwhelmingly an innocent victim. So what I would say is be open about where things are coming from, things like that. On the other hand, there's no reason for us Westerners to participate in that. Yeah? We can recognize where it's coming from, but we can say, sure, but not for us. We're not going to indulge that. So I think that's overwhelmingly the correct answer. And there are many Westerners who have been upset by this decision to allocate the award three-way. And the upset is an expression of very dangerous social media-driven mob fake moralism. Fake not in the sense that people doing it are insincere, but fake in the sense that as a cultural phenomenon, as a social phenomena, it's about some kind of an ever-shifting expression of unhealthy moral outrage that's to a very great extent a product of the social media world, in which people need to, in order to protect their profiles, cling on to various kinds of things that are the right things of the moment to cling on to. And that is often done sincerely, which of course makes it worse. So that's to go back to the question about how do I trust, my sources and so on. Let's then broaden this even further. I mean, there are two pictures of Ukraine going forward after it wins the war. The first picture is that Ukraine does extraordinarily well at tackling corruption, that Ukraine enriches its own conversation with itself, that Ukraine has really good success at consolidating democratic institutions, and that Ukraine is a model of democratic regeneration, not just on the ex-Soviet and East European space, but for all of the West. That's one picture, and it's a bit extremely positive, but that's one picture. The extremely negative picture is that Ukraine is a heavily militarized, corrupt state with toxic internal discourse and dysfunctional institutions. The truth is not going to be at either of these extremes. But what you want to do is always drift to that first scenario where Ukraine is an extraordinary, successful model of democratic flourishing and rejuvenation, and that kind of discourse about not sharing the Nobel Award it isn't the sort of thing that takes us in this positive direction which we all hope for Ukraine. Talk to you very soon. Lots of love.